Part 2 is in order for two reasons. First, to emphasize, clarify, and reinforce several items already addressed in Part 1. 2, to discuss and dissect events and things that have transpired since Part 1 recordation, Purim 2024. For a host of reasons, I have decided this time to present Part 2 as an audio rather than video podcast. First, a quick clarification. In Part 1, Section 3, entitled Israel and its Government, I describe a frightening statistic I recently discovered and brought to light as follows. In the past 75 years since the founding of the State of Israel, discounting the Soviet Union with an asterisk, more than triple as many Jews that were murdered globally were murdered in Israel proper. Be advised, though, that this statistic does not contemplate those who fell in battle. Rather, the statistic only contemplates those murdered, which makes the statistic far more unsettling. So now let me begin with the following eerie but fascinating recount. When my bubby, one of only 2 surviving members of a family of 10, parents and 7 siblings, she having departed Europe pre-war, and a brother that in fact endured and survived the hell of Auschwitz, consulted with rabbis as to the day on which to observe the annual Yortzeit, death anniversary, of her family members, all of whom perished in Nazi Europe, she, and if I recall correctly, anyone that lost loved ones in the Nazi death camps and were unsure as to date and time of such loss, for it simply wasn't possible to determine, was issued a decision as follows. Observe Yortzeit on Simchat Torah, the very date of October 7th, 2023. When you think about it, this is odd and peculiar for a couple reasons. First, out of 365 days of the year, how random is it that this date was chosen? Second, even if one wishes to argue that the rabbi selected a date specifically on which the Yizkor, memorial service, is recited, there are another 3 days in the year when this is so too. Why Simchat Torah? Now, though one may argue that with this latter edification it is now only 1 out of 4, about 25%, and no longer 1 of 365, which is more like 0.27% odds. First, so what? It is still odd that Simchat Torah was chosen over the others. Second, and more importantly, however, it is far less than 25%. Because when one considers the other days of the year on which Yizkor is recited, one is logically compelled to select any of the others but Simchat Torah. After all, the other days are either somber, for example, Yom Kippur, or celebratory ones, but nothing comparable to Simchat Torah. Why select specifically the happiest day of the Jewish calendar, save perhaps for Purim, on which to commemorate death and destruction, not only of my great-grandparents and uncles and aunts, but 6 million Jews? And don't confuse with Israel's Yom HaShoah. I suppose one may argue that a silver lining does exist in that this event occurred specifically on the happiest day of the Jewish calendar. We're already inebriated anyhow on this day. And while in the past the inebriation was a result of joy, in the future it'll serve as anesthetic for the pain and sorrow resulting from the events that unfolded on this day in 2023. In the prologue to Part 1, I delineate a world population division of 3, bad, stupid, and good, for purposes of emphasizing that I am conveying my message of truth and valiance to that third group, the good only. In short, I maintain so because of the famous Talmudic proverb, Da Mashatoshiv, know what and how to respond to the gibberish and vile rancor of the left. In other words, the first 2 categories, the bad and the stupid. And although, as I illuminated in Part 1, there's really no point in countering or reasoning with the 2 former population categories, nonetheless the good must be armed well enough not to fall prey to the bad and stupid, but rather remain steadfast in the emes, veracity, and genuineness of its position, which ought to be unshakable. Let me therefore begin by stating unequivocally that the campus protests are not merely perpetrated by those who innocently, genuinely believe in their position, but are sadly misguided. Rather, these individuals are the essence of evil, mischievous, brutal barbarians, no different from those who carried out October 7th. It's a falsehood to believe otherwise. You see, these protests are monkey see, monkey do. There are very few in the upper echelon, not unlike the Nazi Party, that rile the dumb masses, sell them a bridge in Brooklyn or San Francisco, and so long as it sounds like a cause, excuse to cut class, excuse to engage in so-called civil disobedience, an excuse to hate on Jews, an excuse to engage in ugliness and mayhem and depravity of the worst kind, all of which they are already programmed for anyhow, jump at the opportunity. Why not? It costs nothing and is even praised by many of the silent ringleaders in the higher echelons of society, and these bastards are merely shills for said ringleaders. Moreover, I find it simultaneously tragic and laughable when one interviews or questions one of these moronic so-called Ivy League student protesters, who one would think should be from the intelligentsia. The elicited responses make Patrick Starr sound like a quantum physicist, make Miss Teen USA 2007 of South Carolina sound like Stephen Hawking, and make the Three Stooges sound like the Three Geniuses. Your foolish parents drop $50,000 per year for you to become educated, not for you to squander your vapid, irrelevant, and putrid lives waving colored flags and sporting checkered rags. The Talmud writes, Misha merachem al ha'achzarim sofo sheyitachzer l'rachmanim. He who pities the wicked will someday be wicked to the pitiful. Indeed, this is exactly what we have today around the world, and specifically on college campuses. Even had these protested the Rwandan genocide, which neither they nor their ideological ancestors did, the multiple other African continent genocides of which many endure to this very day, which neither they nor their ideological ancestors did, the Iraqi genocide of the Kurds, which neither they nor their ideological ancestors did, Jordan's Palestinian genocide, which neither they nor their ideological ancestors did, the Turkish genocide of the Armenians, which neither they nor their ideological ancestors did, or the current Russian genocide of the Ukrainians, they would still have no basis or right to protest Israel's incursion into Gaza for two reasons. First, because in the case of Israel, an unprecedented Gazan massacre of epic proportions preceded Israel's land invasion, unlike the others that did not. Second, because the term genocide as related to Israel is a hoax, another blood libel. Gaza boasts a population of roughly 2.5 million inhabitants. Even if we take the so-called laughable Hamas Ministry of Health figures of 50,000 dead civilians, which has been debunked since and appears to be half that figure, that is only about 2.5% of Gaza's population. If that's a genocide, I'd love to be on the receiving end of such a genocide. Why, if Israel really wished to engage in genocide, it would have and could have carpet-bombed Gaza on October 8th, concluding operations on October 9th, with all 2.5 million gone. Instead, it embarked on a fiercely dangerous, treacherous, and surgical operation in which so far 300 of its own have paid with their lives, and more than 10 times that have sustained life-changing injuries. When I think about these pathetic protests, I think about the fact that just as Hamas and the Palestinians and other Arab sects had a good 20 years from roughly 2001, when the Muslim Intifada in Israel and globally ratcheted up, beginning with 9/11 and onward, to raise a new generation of truly automatonic, sociopathic Shaheed killers, the universities likewise had a good generation, while the good were asleep at the wheel, to raise a generation of automatonic, sociopathic Shaheed killers as well. A wonderfully toxic filet mignon served up. I find it ironic that most of the Arab countries, save for Jordan occasionally, have not engaged in any protests or demonstrations because, frankly, they don't give a damn about their own. And the only reason Jordan does protest on occasion is because it knows well that if there is a Palestine, it is it. And it certainly doesn't want him. See Black September 1970 in my part 1. The worst thing about these so-called protests, which aren't that at all, but rather far more violent and pogrom-like, is the aftermath or world reaction. And these pogromists know it, and that's why they continue to do it brazenly and with malice aforethought. Here's the general world narrative. Instead of it watching these pogroms on TV or the internet and reacting, quote, "What a bunch of bums, what a bunch of losers, thugs, violent beasts, horrible and irredeemable. Not only do they clash with the opposition, but also with law enforcement and innocent bystanders," unquote. It reacts, quote, "Look at what the Jew causes globally. Look at the unrest in the world, all because of the Jew," unquote. Not unlike Kristallnacht and many other similar awful historic events that befell our people over 2,000 years. Case in point, when I was a young boy and was entranced by the whimsical Jewish blood libel stories of yore, primarily those relating to Jews in the 15th and 16th centuries in Prague and elsewhere, I was somewhat dumbfounded. Even as a child, I was quite perceptive and inquisitive. I would ask myself, the Gentiles libel the Jews that we require Christian blood in our Pesach matzah. First, why Christian? Second, why a Christian child? Third, why blood? Fourth, instead of libeling, can't the Gentiles conduct a simple matzah blood test, even in the primitive 16th century? Fifth, why only one child? You have any idea how much matzah Jews consume on Passover? Surely we require the blood of more than one child, yet the story is always one Christian child gone missing. Sixth, did the Jews not employ a phlebotomist? After all, if we require merely the blood, not the life, why not draw blood and insert it into the matzah ingredients? I thought to myself, something's amiss. It is too preposterous. Only a fool, or should I say virulent intellectual anti-Semite, could accuse the Jews of such horrid tactics, and adding insult to injury, make the argument so cogent that the masses are convinced. But lo, no longer are these questions, no longer is the trademark blood libel an enigma. It is here and now today, alive and well, more sophisticated, but ultimately just the same. Why the world doesn't only accuse Israel of genocide, it accuses it of the very crimes Hamas engaged in on October 7th, including rape, torture, starvation, etc. I vividly recall sometime in 1987 or 88 the story that was told in Tunis as follows. In the dead of night, the entire city suffered a sudden and unprecedented power outage. A band of masked mercenaries made their way into the home of Abu Jihad, the mastermind of the Intifada at the time. The mercenaries proceeded to pump his body with more than 75 bullets, and when thereafter what was thought to be his wife was yelling and sobbing uncontrollably, one of the mercenaries ordered a daughter that was present to go calm her mother, and the mercenaries departed swiftly, never to be seen or heard from again. To this day, it is a mystery as to whom these mercenaries were. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out this one, does it? But here's the kicker. Israel went to ridiculous lengths to pull off something so high risk, dangerous, and significantly costly in time, money, precision planning, and more. And yet, it simply targeted the target because that was its mission and nothing further. It didn't murder, torture, or rape mother or daughter. It rather let them be in peace and went on its way. And that's Israel at its worst. Don't you ever accuse it of its enemies' shenanigans. We Jews are simply not built that way. A large part of the reason the world hates us. Israel does not allow for a level playing field. For years I've maintained that lovers will be lovers and haters will be haters. That is to say that Israel must and should have done what needs to be done. After all, as for the Gentile Jew lover, the Jews in Israel can do no wrong. Conversely, as for the Gentile Jew hater, the Jews in Israel can do no right. So then why waste its time treading on eggshells to please the fakakta world? The Jew lover wouldn't care if Israel cleaned house. Conversely, the Jew hater wouldn't care if it neither killed nor injured a single Palestinian, even a convicted terrorist. So why does Israel continue with its stupidity? Don't answer that question. It was asked rhetorically. So far as I'm concerned, one has better odds of hitting the mega millions than those associated with the October 7th massacre. If one adds all the variables, possibilities, probabilities, and scenarios of October 7th, the odds are nearly those associated with the eye coming into existence by mere genetic mutation. If I recall correctly, it's something like 10 to the 300th power. For all intents and purposes, an impossibility. Unless, as I stated in part 1, it was in fact an inside job. To what degree, I'm not sure, but there's little doubt that regardless of degree, inside it certainly was. Now, while those are odds of October 7th happening, I feel compelled to now describe how bad was October 7th. Let's try some "your mother is so" jokes to describe same. How bad was October 7th? October 7th was so bad that Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, and Jason Voorhees dusted off and uploaded their 9-to-5 resumes to ZipRecruiter. How bad was October 7th? October 7th was so bad that on October 17th, Truman Capote heaved the sole sequel manuscript copy into his fireplace. How bad was October 7th? October 7th was so bad that after he watched 30 minutes of that day's footage, John Wayne Gacy sobbed and vomited. How bad was October 7th? October 7th was so bad that Nicholas Cruz is appealing to the authorities for a furlough so that he may embark on a do-over. How bad was October 7th? October 7th was so bad that October 6th and 8th submitted a joint petition to be removed from the calendar forever. How bad was October 7th? October 7th was so bad that Hannibal Lecter flew to Gaza to enroll in Hamas's Ivy League state-of-the-art terror and barbarian program. How bad was October 7th? October 7th was so bad that even if all 1,200 were magically, miraculously resurrected and returned perfectly unblemished and unscathed, like the dry bones in Ezekiel's vision, it will have changed nothing. Not the rage, not the gruesomeness, not the devilish evil. Nothing. How bad was October 7th? October 7th was so bad that it changed the entire Jewish, not just Israel, landscape forever. In Genesis, the Torah tells us that God proclaimed to Abraham regarding his son Ishmael, "V'hu yiyeh pera adam, yadoi bakol v'yad kol bo." He will be a wild, uncouth beast. His hand will be upon everyone, and everyone will detest him. Funny how some of us foolishly think Torah is old-fashioned and primitive, when it, in just one verse, prognosticated 2023. In the appendices of my latest book, Tavlin 360, available at Amazon, you will find an anti-Semitism thesis, and although I will not take up time here reading the entire thesis, I think it is greatly imperative that I do read footnote 264 as follows. Additionally, with each passing day since the Sinai event, anti-Semitism's illogical and illogical vitriol and virulence is proven more and more. First, the illogic. Jews, as a rule, are the most peaceful, pacifistic, and patriotic, hardly engage in violence or insurrection and the like, live by rules, follow protocol, and are respectful of and thankful toward their respective host countries. Second, and more importantly, anti-Semitism is the quintessence of illogic. If the anti-Semite wishes to rid the world of Jews, he must as well be prepared to rid the world and himself of all the contributions made by and benefits the world derives from the Jew. The anti-Semite may not be allowed to have his cake and eat it too. Thus, if you decry the Jew, decry polio vaccine and a lot of medicine. Decry Rothschild, decry banking. If you don't care for Ehrlich, then you cannot care about leukemia much either, or chemo and immunotherapy, or syphilis or penicillin. If you don't care for funk, then vitamins must go by the wayside as well. If you don't care for Bloch, then by the same token you shouldn't care about cholesterol. If you don't care about Einstein, Bohr, or Neumann, then you can't care about quantum physics. If no Einstein, no Time Magazine Man of the Century either. If you don't care for Minkowski, then you most definitely would have to kill Minkowski's space-time theory as well. If you don't care for Freud, Frankl, or Adler, then you cannot give two hoots about psychology. If no Feynman, then no nanotechnology either. If no Goldman, no plastic surgery. If no Zoll, away with pacemakers and defibrillators as well. If you don't care for Sarnoff, Goldwyn, or Meyer, then you can't care for Hollywood either. There I may actually agree with you. No Levine, no Potter. If no Rabbi, no MRI. If no Rubin, no batteries. If no Page and Brin, no Google. If no Zuckerberg, no Facebook. If no Coombe, no WhatsApp. If no Ellison, no Oracle. If no Mattis, no Haagen-Dazs. If no Schultz, no Starbucks. If no Rosenberg, no Dunkin' Donuts. If no Strauss, no Levi's. If no Hassenfeld, Handler, or Lazarus, then no Hasbro, Mattel, or Toys R Us either. If no Horowitz, then no Moe, Larry, or Curly. If no Marx, then no Groucho, Zeppo, Chico, or Harpo. If no Guggenheim, then no Guggenheim. If no Kafka, Roth, Miller, Frank, Wiesel, Asimov, Bellow, then no modern literature. If you wish to dispose of Eichengrun, then you must bring back gonorrhea. If you wish to dispatch Waxman, then you must allow strep throat to run rampant. If no Stiglitz and Leibovitz, then no great photography. If no Eisenstein, Lang, Wilder, Weiler, Cukor, Kubrick, Lumet, Polanski, Allen, Spielberg, then no film. If no Mendelssohn, Strauss, Mahler, Schoenberg, Gershwin, Copland, Rubinstein, Bernstein, Heifetz, and Menuhin, then no classical music either. If no Zimmerman, Kravitz, Diamond, Simon, Garfunkel, Winehouse, Joel, Levine, then no pop music either. If no Lee, no Marvel or Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man. If no Pritzker, no Pritzker Prize. If no Pulitzer, no Pulitzer Prize. If no Reichman, no UNICEF. If no Brandeis, Frankfurter, Breyer, Ginsburg, Cardozo, Goldberg, Fortis, no American jurisprudential prowess. If you wish to exterminate the Jews, then you must likewise exorcise 25% of Nobel Prizes heretofore awarded, and with such exorcism, obliterate as well the achievements and inroads said 25% represents. Thus, the only real answer to the anti-Semitic question that makes any sense at all is that we were doomed at Sinai on account of the wake-up call to which we enlightened the world, and it has held a grudge ever since. The great American economist, social philosopher, and political commentator, Thomas Sowell, puts it another way. When asked what the Jews can do to finally end or rein in anti-Semitism, Sowell, in his brilliantly pithy style, responded one word: fail. And while the Jew has given the world all this largesse and contributed more than any other race, people, nation, or ethnic group, especially when you consider his unbelievably infinitesimal numbers, plus add the brutal conditions under which he achieved same, the Muslim has contributed falafel, bloodshed, shawarma, bloodshed, baklawa, bloodshed, knafe, bloodshed, hashish, bloodshed, and oh yeah, algebra. In part one, I state unequivocally that Israel's done, and whomsoever believes otherwise is merely a Titanic musician. I won't here repeat the reasons I believe so. You are welcome to view part one at your convenience. But I do wish to add a very practical and pragmatic reason this is so, even if one wishes to argue with me on the other cogent premises I outline in part one for this position. Financial. The war is costing Israel roughly $270 million per day. You do the math. Suffice it to say that such an exorbitant sum of money is not sustainable were the United States waging war, let alone little Israel. And even with America's so-called financial assistance, first, U.S. has recently been withholding same, so a lot of good that does. Second, at some point, such financial aid is still insufficient to maintain a healthy balance in Israel's treasury and will ultimately bankrupt the country. Hamas knew this and knows this too. I find it hilarious when I see YouTubers and podcasters of all sizes, shapes, creeds, and colors, as well as many in London's Hyde Park Speaker's Corner, uttering such foolishness as, quote, Jews and Muslims lived side by side for years in peace and harmony. They ask, are you not familiar with the Golden Age, the 300 years between 11 and 1400, when Jews enjoyed blissful living and lifestyle under their Muslim ruling class? Are you unaware, they ask, of Mohammed V of Morocco and his wonderful relationship with and protection of his Jewish subjects, saving most from certain Nazi deportation and extermination? They do so ostensibly as a defense to the claim that anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. First, while their claim is nearly accurate, it is not entirely. We suffered under the Muslims as well, only in comparison to our Christian neighbors in the Ashkenaz world, the above statement and sentiment is quite accurate and indisputable. Second, though, and more importantly, so what? The Talmud recounts regarding Rabbi Yochanan, high priest, not merely one of the greatest Tannaic scholars, but a high priest too, that he suddenly at age 80 turned, became an apostate, converted from fiercely Pharisee to Sadducee. How does this happen? Well, that answer is beyond the scope of this subject. I simply relate this here to point out the absurdity of the argument. Son of Sam was likely a good guy till he no longer was. Now I know what they're driving at. They're driving at the fact that the Muslim world turned against us because of the creation of the State of Israel. And so therefore their hate and animus, murder and mayhem are now justified. Really? If Israel never belonged to the Jews and were merely pilferers, abject thieves, their abhorrence and its manifestations would still be unjustified. How much more so when the land is clearly, exclusively ours. Don't let the intellectuals get to you either. This is why I maintain in part one that the intellectuals are worse than those who carried out the October 7th massacre. Most people are in awe of intellectuals because they assume that intelligence alone is awe or respect-inducing, that it automatically makes one beyond reproach. Oh, how foolish and how sad. But I can't and don't expect any more from the masses who are, after all, asses. Why, I am fond of saying that the doofus who now occupies the White House is really a greater testament to the odiousness of the American people. That he is the commander-in-chief of the so-called free world is a testament to how far we've fallen from both truth and virtue, as well as off our rocker. But I digress. Here's the thing about the intellectual, and you will, if you're not entirely thick-headed or dishonest, get his game. In a nutshell, he is very good at taking the exception or the obscure and making it sound like the rule. That's it. That's his game. That's his racket. I just disclosed to you the secret of the corrupt intellectual mind. So, for example, an intellectual will argue that the Peel Commission made a grave error, or that in and of itself it was an error entirely. Now, let's even assume that this position is not subjective, unlike most of the intellectuals' conjecture, but that it is in fact objective, or at least that a plurality agrees. So it goes something like this. Because the Peel Commission is the linchpin for the formation of the State of Israel, and it may have erred or is an error altogether, the State of Israel likewise is erroneous and illegitimate. This is how the intellectual mind works. Its intellectualism lies much more in its craftiness and surreptitiousness of making an argument as ludicrous as this sound coherent and cogent, so that again the dumb masses eat it up hook, line, and sinker. Watch any of them and tell me it's not so. And to Spain, whose anti-Semitism dates to pre-Maimonidean, Ireland, whose anti-Semitism dates to pre-St. Patrick, Norway, whose Oslo Accords is the primary catalyst of the Intifada to begin with, I close with the following superb open letter to the world Rabbi Meir Kahane HaKadosh wrote in 1988, 2 years prior to his assassination. Dear world, it appears that you are hard to please. I understand that you are upset over us here in Israel. Indeed, it appears that you are quite upset, even angry and outraged. Indeed, every few years you seem to become upset over us. Today it is the brutal repression of the Palestinians. Yesterday it was Lebanon. Before that it was the bombing of the nuclear reactor in Baghdad and the Yom Kippur War campaign. It appears that Jews who triumph and who therefore live upset you most extraordinarily. Of course, dear world, long before there was an Israel, we, the Jewish people, upset you. We upset a German people who elected Hitler, and we upset an Austrian people who cheered his entry into Vienna, and we upset a whole slew of Slavic nations, Poles, Slovaks, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Russians, Hungarians, Romanians, and we go back a long, long way in the history of world upset. We upset the Cossacks of Khmelnytsky, who massacred hundreds of thousands of us in 1648-49. We upset the Crusaders, who, on their way to liberate the Holy Land, were so upset at Jews that they slaughtered untold numbers of us. We upset for centuries a Roman Catholic Church that did its best to define our relationship through inquisitions. And we upset the archenemy of the Church, Martin Luther, who in his call to burn the synagogues and the Jews within them showed an admirable Christian ecumenical spirit. It is because we became so upset over upsetting you, dear world, that we decided to leave you in a manner of speaking and establish a Jewish state. The reasoning was that living in close contact with you, as resident strangers in the various countries that comprise you, we upset you, irritate you, disturb you. What better notion, then, than to leave you and thus love you and have you love us? And so we decided to come home to the same homeland from which we were driven out 1900 years earlier by a Roman world that apparently we also upset. Alas, dear world, it appears that you are hard to please, having left you and your pogroms and inquisitions and crusades and holocausts. Having taken our leave of the general world to live alone in our little state, we continue to upset you. You are upset that we repress the poor Palestinians. You are deeply angered over the fact that we do not give up the lands of 1967, which are clearly the obstacle to peace in the Middle East. Moscow is upset and Washington is upset. The Arabs are upset and the gentle Egyptian moderates are upset. Well, dear world, consider the reaction of a normal Jew from Israel. In 1920, 21, and 29, there were no territories of 1967 to impede peace between Jews and Arabs. Indeed, there was no Jewish state to upset anybody. Nevertheless, the same oppressed and repressed Palestinians slaughtered hundreds of Jews in Jerusalem, Jaffa, Safad, and Hebron. Indeed, 67 Jews were slaughtered one day alone in Hebron in 1929. Dear world, why did the Arabs, the Palestinians, massacre 67 Jews in one day in 1929? Could it have been their anger over Israeli aggression in 1967? And why were 510 Jewish men, women, and children slaughtered in Arab riots in 1936 through 39? Was it because of Arab upset over 1967? And when you world proposed a UN partition plan in 1947 that would have created a Palestinian state alongside a tiny Israel, and the Arabs cried and went to war and killed 6,000 Jews, was that upset stomach caused by the aggression of 1967? The poor Palestinians who today kill Jews with explosives and firebombs and stones are part of the same people who, when they had all the territories they now demand be given them for their state, attempted to drive the Jewish state into the sea. The same twisted faces, the same hate, the same cry of Itbach al-Yahud, slaughter the Jews, that we hear and see today were seen and heard then. The same people, the same dream, destroy Israel. What they failed to do yesterday, they dream of today, but we should not repress them. Dear world, you stood by the Holocaust and you stood by in 1948 as 7 states launched a war that the Arab League proudly compared to the Mongol massacres. You stood by in 1967 as Nasser wildly cheered and wild mobs in every Arab capital in the world vowed to drive the Jews into the sea. And you would stand by tomorrow if Israel were facing extinction. And since we know that the Arab Palestinians daily dream of that extinction, we will do everything possible to remain alive in our land. If that bothers you, dear world, well, think of how many times in the past you bothered us. In any event, dear world, if you are bothered by us, here is one Jew in Israel who doesn't give a damn.